The year was 1773. While angry colonists in Boston Harbor were dumping tea into the Atlantic to protest British taxation, halfway around the world, the British East India Company was perfecting something far more sinister. In the fertile plains of Bengal, where families had farmed rice and wheat for generations, company officials were forcing peasants at gunpoint to rip up their food crops and plant something else. Poppies. Millions of them. Row after endless row of white and purple flowers that would be harvested, processed, and transformed into opium. Not for medicine, not for the relief of suffering, for profit. The kind of industrial-scale drug production that would make modern cartels look like corner dealers. By the time the operation reached its peak in the 1880s, the British government was licensing over 1.5 million cultivators, processing their harvest in vast factories at Patna and Ghazipur, and shipping 104,000 40-kilo chests annually to a single destination: China. A nation that had banned the drug, a market that didn't want it, a population that would be systematically addicted by force. This wasn't a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows. This was the British government, the Crown, the world's supposed beacon of civilization and moral authority. And they didn't just tolerate the opium trade. They built it. They protected it. They went to war for it. Twice. When China tried to stop the destruction of its people, Britain responded with warships, superior firepower, and a simple message: you will buy our drugs, or we will destroy you. The operation generated revenue so enormous that by 1843, opium had become the second largest source of income for British India, outmatched only by land taxes. £5 million annually, enough to service the entire cost of imperial expansion across the subcontinent. Enough to fund armies, administrations, and the machinery of empire. The British didn't just run a drug cartel, they ran the most successful narco state in human history, and they did it all under the Union Jack. Here's what they never taught you in school. Here's the history they erased from the textbooks. Here's how the British Empire became the world's largest drug cartel. The machinery of addiction began with a problem. For decades, Britain had been hemorrhaging silver to China. British society had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. By the early 1800s, the average London worker was spending 5% of their household budget on tea alone. But China wanted nothing Britain produced. Not heavy woolen fabrics in a country accustomed to silk and cotton. Not manufactured goods from a civilization that viewed itself as the center of the world. The Chinese would only accept payment in silver, pure silver, and Britain's reserves were draining away. The trade deficit was unsustainable. Something had to be done. The solution was elegant in its cruelty. Opium had been used in China for centuries as medicine, taken orally in small quantities to relieve pain. But in the mid-1700s, a new practice emerged: mixing opium with tobacco and smoking it. The recreational use spread, and with it came addiction on a scale China had never seen. The British saw opportunity. If China wouldn't buy British products, they would create demand for something else, something that would reverse the flow of silver, something that would hook an entire nation. In 1773, the same year they monopolized opium in Bengal, the British began shipping the drug to China in earnest. The East India Company took control of every step of the supply chain. They issued licenses to Indian peasants, forcing them to cultivate poppies on the most fertile land available, land that could have fed families, land that could have grown wheat or rice or vegetables. Instead, it grew poison. The economics of coercion were brutal. Peasants who accepted the licenses received advances from the company, locking them into debt before they'd planted a single seed.
The poppy cultivation was backbreaking, land that required constant irrigation, where a single person could only water 1/8 of an acre per day using manual levers at the wells, often 2 to 4 levers operating simultaneously if the farmer could afford the labor. The soil had to be plowed repeatedly, the work exhausting. Planting happened in October, and then came the harvest. Harvesting opium wasn't like harvesting grain. It required painstaking, skilled labor. Workers would lance individual poppy pods with special tools, making precise cuts to allow the milky latex to ooze out without damaging the plant. Each pod had to be lanced multiple times over several days. The raw opium gum would be collected, brought home, weighed, mixed, and sent in jars to government depots. At the company's massive factories in Patna for the Bihar crop and Ghazipur for the Benares crop, hundreds of workers would process the opium. The company wanted opium so pure, so consistent, that it would command top prices at auction. Bengal opium became known as the gold standard. Malwa opium from Western India might be cheaper, but Bengal opium, produced under British monopoly control, was what serious dealers wanted. Each cake of processed opium was carefully wrapped, coated, and packaged in wooden chests. Each chest contained 140 pounds of refined opium. Each chest represented months of peasant labor, factory processing, and company investment. Each chest was worth hundreds of pounds sterling at auction, and each chest was a weapon pointed at China. The chests were shipped to Calcutta, where they were sold at monthly auctions to private merchants. The British government didn't want its fingerprints directly on the China smuggling operation, so they created plausible deniability. Private merchants, mostly British and American, would purchase the opium in India, transport it to China, and sell it to Chinese smugglers who would distribute it inland. The system was brilliant. If caught, it was rogue merchants, not the British Crown, trafficking drugs. But everyone knew the truth. The British government controlled production, set prices, collected revenues, and used naval power to protect the entire operation. The numbers tell the story of systematic poisoning. In 1729, when China first prohibited opium, imports were around 200 chests annually. By 1773, when the British monopoly began, it had grown to 1,000 chests. By 1800, after China reissued prohibition in starker terms, it had leaped to 4,550 chests. By 1835, it had exploded to 35,445 chests. That's over 2,310 metric tons of opium, worth millions of pounds sterling flooding into China every year. Watch what happened to the silver. Before 1828, large quantities of Spanish silver coins, the Carolus dollar, flowed into China in payment for tea, silk, and porcelain. In the single decade of the 1830s, only $7.3 million worth of silver was imported into China. Meanwhile, $26.6 million in foreign silver coin, $25.5 million in Sicily, and $3.6 million in gold flowed out. The drain was catastrophic. The trade surplus China had enjoyed for centuries reversed. The empire that had accumulated wealth for millennia was hemorrhaging its monetary reserves to pay for an addictive drug it had banned. In fiscal year 1835-36 alone, China exported 4.5 million silver dollars more than it imported. And where was that silver going? Back to British India,
where it would be used to purchase more Chinese tea at Calcutta, completing a triangular trade route of death. Britain bought tea from China with opium money. India produced opium for British profit. China lost silver, gained addicts, and watched its economy implode. It was economic warfare disguised as trade. The human cost was catastrophic. Conservative estimates by 1840 put the number of Chinese opium addicts at 4 million. British physicians practicing in Canton set the figure at 12 million.
90% of Chinese males under 40 in coastal regions were regular users. The drug didn't discriminate. It destroyed laborers and landlords, merchants and scholars, peasants and officials. Business activity collapsed. Government offices ground to a halt. Fields went unharvested. Families disintegrated. The social fabric of Chinese civilization was being shredded by a foreign substance deliberately introduced for profit. Chinese emperors tried to stop it. In 1729, the Yongzheng Emperor prohibited the sale and smoking of opium. In 1796, the Jia-Qing Emperor outlawed importation and cultivation entirely. In 1799, he reissued the ban in even starker terms. In 1814, in 1831, again and again and again. The edicts meant nothing. The British kept shipping, the smugglers kept distributing, the addiction kept spreading, because behind every shipment was the implicit threat of British naval power, and everyone knew it. Then came the man who refused to play along. In December 1838, the Daoguang Emperor appointed Lin Zexu as special imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to eradicate the opium trade. Lin was a scholar official of impeccable integrity, a man who had successfully suppressed drug trafficking in every province he governed. He understood what was at stake. Without due action, he wrote to the emperor, China will soon have no soldiers to fight for the country and no money to pay for national defense. He arrived in Canton in March 1839 with a small entourage, an outrider, 6 guards, and 3 kitchen staff. No corruption, no compromises, no fear. Lin moved with surgical precision. He arrested over 1,600 Chinese dealers. He seized and destroyed tens of thousands of opium pipes. He summoned the 12 Chinese merchants of the Kohong who acted as intermediaries for foreign traders and called them traitors. He gave them 3 days to convince foreign merchants to surrender all opium in their possession, or 2 of them would be executed and their wealth confiscated. When the foreign merchants dismissed his threats as a bluff, Lin surrounded the foreign factories with troops, cut off their food and water supplies, and placed 350 foreign residents under house arrest. He wasn't negotiating, he was demanding surrender. Charles Elliot, the British superintendent of trade, realized Lin was serious. To defuse the situation and protect British merchants, Elliot convinced them to surrender their opium stockpiles with a promise. The British government would compensate them for their losses. On March 27, 1839, British traders handed over 20,283 chests of opium, over 1,420 tons, over 3.1 million pounds, worth 2 million pounds sterling. It was the largest drug bust in history. Lin didn't just confiscate it, he destroyed it, publicly, ceremonially, as a statement to the world. On June 3, 1839, at Human Beach outside Canton, the process began. 500 workers labored in shifts. The operation would last 23 days. They cracked open the chests one by one, exposing the dark brown cakes of processed opium inside. They weighed each chest to verify the British hadn't tried to cheat. They minced the opium into smaller pieces. Then came the chemical destruction. Large stone pools had been specially constructed on the beach. Workers filled the pools with seawater, mixed in the minced opium, then added lime and salt. The lime reacted with the opium alkaloids, breaking down the molecular structure. The salt prevented any residue from being recoverable. They stirred the mixture constantly, ensuring complete decomposition. And then, during low tide, they opened sluice gates and let the contaminated water flow out to sea, where it would be diluted into nothingness by the vast Pacific. Lin didn't burn the opium, even though that would have been faster. He understood chemistry better than that. Opium ashes from incineration could seep into the ground. Addicts with shovels could recover 20 to 30% of the drug from contaminated soil. Burning was too risky. Dissolving it completely in seawater was the only way to ensure total destruction. Before the destruction began, Lin performed a ritual. He wrote a formal apology to the Dragon King of the South China Sea, explaining what he was about to do and asking the spirit to warn sea creatures to temporarily move away to avoid contamination. He understood he was poisoning the ocean, but he had no choice. The opium had to be destroyed so completely that not one molecule could be salvaged. Over those 23 days, as the sun beat down on Human Beach and the workers stirred pool after pool of decomposing narcotics, Lin Zexu was making history. This was the largest drug bust ever conducted. Over 1,420 tons of pure opium, over 3.1 million pounds, worth 2 million pounds sterling, enough to supply every addict in China for months. All of it systematically destroyed, all of it rendered useless, all of it flushed into the sea. He was trying to save his nation. He was trying to prove that China would not submit, that the drug trade could be stopped, that morality could triumph over profit. He also wrote a letter, an open appeal to Queen Victoria. Your Majesty has not before been thus officially notified, and you may plead ignorance of the severity of our laws, but now I give my assurance that we mean to cut this harmful drug forever. He appealed to her moral reasoning, pointing out what he believed to be Britain's own prohibition of opium. There is only self-interest in profits without any regard for human life. This is unjust and should be condemned. He questioned how Britain could declare itself a civilized nation, while its merchants systematically poisoned another nation's people. The letter was eloquent, it was sincere, it was desperate, and it never reached the Queen. Some sources say it was lost in transit, others suggest it was deliberately suppressed. Either way, Queen Victoria never responded. The Crown had no interest in morality, only profit. What Lin didn't understand was that his actions had done something far more dangerous than destroying opium. By forcing Elliot to promise compensation, he had created a massive liability on the British Exchequer. 2 million pounds the British government couldn't pay without causing a political storm at home. But they could force China to pay it. And to do that, they needed a justification for war. Lin had just handed it to them. They would call it a trade dispute, a violation of British property rights, an attack on British sovereignty. They would say nothing about the opium, nothing about the addiction, nothing about the millions of Chinese lives destroyed. They would wrap the whole sordid business in the language of free trade and diplomatic respect. In November 1839, Chinese warships clashed with British merchantmen. The First Opium War had begun. In June 1840, 16 British warships arrived at Canton. Many were leased from Jardine Matheson and Company, the primary British opium producer. Think about that. The drug dealers were literally financing the military operation to protect their drug trade. The narco traffickers had rented
out their ships to the Royal Navy. Over the next 2 years, British forces bombarded forts, fought battles, and seized cities up and down the Chinese coast. The military mismatch was absolute. Chinese forces fought with courage, but courage meant nothing against industrial warfare. British steam-powered gunboats could navigate upriver where traditional junks couldn't follow. British percussion-lock muskets could fire 3 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy, while Chinese soldiers were still using matchlock firearms and crossbows. British naval artillery could shell coastal fortifications from distances Chinese cannons couldn't reach.
and Britain's soldiers had just finished toughening their skills in the Napoleonic Wars. They were professional killers facing armies that hadn't fought a major conflict in decades. The Chinese military was decimated. On May 27, 1841, British forces captured Canton after overwhelming the defenders. They withdrew only after the Chinese agreed to pay £60,000 in reparations. When Charles Elliot, who negotiated that settlement, was dismissed by Lord Palmerston for not extracting enough concessions, his replacement, Sir Henry Pottinger, imposed even harsher demands. The British northern advance, capturing cities sequentially. Amoy, August 26 to 27, 1841. Chusan retaken, October 1. Systematic coastal city conquest. Qinghai on October 10th at the cost of only 3 British dead and 16 wounded. Ningpo fell unopposed on October 13th. The casualty ratios told the story. For every British soldier killed, dozens of Chinese died. This wasn't war. It was slaughter backed by technological superiority and imperial arrogance. The Treaty of Nanking was signed on August 29, 1842, aboard a British warship at the mouth of the Yangtze. The terms were designed to humiliate. China had to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, including 6 million for the destroyed opium. China had to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. China had to open 5 treaty ports to British trade where foreigners could live and work outside Chinese legal jurisdiction. China had to grant Britain most favored nation trading status, and, crucially, although the treaty made no mention of opium, it removed all barriers to the drug trade. The flow of narcotics resumed immediately and accelerated dramatically. But Britain wasn't finished. In 1856, they went back for more. The Second Opium War was fought between Britain, France, and China from 1856 to 1860. This time, the Western powers demanded complete legalization of the opium trade, expansion of treaty ports, residence for Western diplomats in Beijing, freedom of movement for Christian missionaries, and control over Chinese customs. China lost again. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 forced China to legalize opium, pay massive war reparations, and open 10 more ports. By 1858, annual opium imports to China had reached 70,000 chests. By the end of the century, it would rise to between 50,000 and 60,000 chests annually, sustained for 3 more decades. The British called it free trade. They called it opening China to civilization. They called it protecting British interests. But let's be clear about what it actually was. It was state-sponsored drug trafficking on industrial scale. It was the systematic addiction of millions for profit. It was war waged to protect a narcotics racket. If this had been done by Colombia, by Mexico, by Afghanistan, we would call it exactly what it is, a drug cartel. The largest, most successful, most devastating drug cartel in human history, and it was run by the British Crown. Lin Zexu, the one man who tried to stop it, was made the scapegoat. The Daoguan emperor, who had personally approved every one of Lin's actions, turned on him the moment the war went badly. Lin was stripped of his position, exiled to the northwest frontier, and spent years in disgrace. He served loyally and quietly, was eventually rehabilitated, and died in 1950 while traveling to suppress the Taiping Rebellion. He never saw China recover from the century of humiliation he tried to prevent. His failure proved something crucial. The system itself was irredeemable. When the most capable, most honest, most determined official in the Chinese government couldn't stop the drug trade, it wasn't because of personal failure. It was because he was fighting an empire with warships, industrial production, and the political will to use overwhelming violence to protect drug profits. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. The legacy never ended. Hong Kong, the city Britain took as payment for protecting drug smugglers, remained under British control until 1997. For over 150 years, one of the world's greatest financial centers existed because it was the prize seized in an opium war. The treaty ports forced open in 1842 became the foundations of Western economic penetration of China. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, cities that still shape global trade today. The extraterritoriality Britain demanded, where British citizens in China were immune from Chinese law, established a precedent for colonial legal privilege that lasted a century. Even the factories still stand. The opium processing facilities the British built at Ghazipur in 1820 and expanded in 1855 remain operational today. They're run by the Indian government now, producing legal pharmaceutical opium under international supervision. But they're in the same buildings, using systems descended directly from the British infrastructure of drug production. The same East India Company design, the same monopoly structure. When India gained independence in 1947, the new government didn't dismantle the system, they adopted it. The British, rather than native Indian model of opium control, became law. The wealth extracted from the opium trade funded the expansion of the British Empire across Asia. It paid for armies that conquered Burma, Malaya, and territories across the Pacific. It financed infrastructure, administration, and the machinery of colonial control. Families who made fortunes in the opium trade became pillars of British society. Firms like Jardine Matheson, founded by opium smugglers, became legitimate multinational corporations that still operate today. The money was laundered through time and respectability. The crime became heritage. Meanwhile, China descended into what it calls the century of humiliation. The Opium Wars shattered the Qing dynasty's authority. The addiction epidemic continued to ravage the population for decades. When the dynasty finally collapsed in 1911, regional warlords and occupying Japanese forces all depended on opium taxes as major revenue sources. Over a century of addiction, over a century of foreign exploitation, all traceable back to 1773, when the British decided that forcing India to grow drugs and forcing China to buy them was sound imperial policy. Today, when Chinese officials talk about resisting foreign interference, when they speak of never again allowing China to be weak or backward, when they pursue aggressive nationalism and military buildup, they're not speaking abstractly. They're remembering the Opium Wars. They're remembering Lin Zexu standing alone against an empire. They're remembering treaties signed on gunboats. They're remembering that the West once went to war to force them to accept poison. That memory shapes Chinese foreign policy. It shapes their view of international law. It shapes their determination to never again be vulnerable to Western power. The trauma is generational. The anger is institutional. And it all goes back to British opium. So when you see Hong Kong's financial district, remember it was founded as a drug smuggling port. When you hear about British moral authority in international affairs, remember they waged war to protect narcotics trafficking. When you see the wealth of old British families and corporations, ask where that seed money came from. When you hear about the importance of free trade, remember what they meant by free trade in 1840, the right to poison a nation for profit. The British Empire didn't just tolerate a drug cartel, they were the drug cartel. The Crown, the East India Company, Parliament, the Royal Navy, all of them complicit in the largest drug trafficking